Okay, we've got 1 minute, and then we're gonna dive right in. So we have a lot to cover, but I'm really glad y'all decided to join us this morning. Everything that we're gonna cover today is gonna be shared with you. So I will admit the content is dense. There's a lot of material here. So I'll share all this with you guys, and will remain available to you after all this to follow up and have as many conversations as you would like. So for those of you that I have not met before, my name is Shad. I'm based here in Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm the managing partner of the Edmondson Berry Group. And the Edmondson Berry Group exists as an advisory firm to help uh, develop leaders. What I would say is to provide transformative leadership development. And a lot of that transformation has to do with the things we're going to be talking about today. And we also exist to help leaders build valuable businesses, or businesses that have transferable value. And that's a really important term, because whether you on this call, whether you own your business or not, if you're involved in leadership, then it's really important that you understand what creates value that can be transferred. And that transfer can mean transferring leadership, which we would refer to as a stewardship, a position of authority that's not permanent, that you will transfer to somebody else, which implies a lot of things, preparation being one of those, development being one of those. So I exist. Our job here and our team's job is to help leaders transform so that they can build businesses and organizations that have transferable value. So our task as leaders is to lead and use our appropriate authority in a way that's going to drive value in our respective organizations. And one of the ways that that happens is with people. The conversations that we're in routinely, daily, around a leader and a leader's challenges with people are endless. It typically starts there. And one of the things that has become just a passion of mine. And I'm not saying I'm good at this, by the way, I'm still learning. But one of the things that has become a passion of mine is making certain that when you and I describe behavior, when you and I describe people and how they're behaving, that we properly describe that and properly label that. Um, I know that many of you on this call, and some of y'all, we've done work together leveraging various psychometrics or assessment tools. Um, the things we're talking about, many of them can be measured, but this is not a presentation about assessments today. This conversation is really attempting to disrupt some of your own thinking, some of your own habits about how you think about people and describe people. Importantly, also how you describe yourself. I say to all of our clients, how you talk to yourself about yourself is really important, but that also translates in many cases of how you describe or talk about other people. So today, this next hour, and hopefully y'all are in a place where you can just really lock in. I know that some of y'all may be on the fly, but if you're able to lock in and think about how can I better and more accurately see people, understand people, guide people, develop them, and create more ownership and capacity in them. That's really what I want this conversation to be about. And so we'll start with a question that all of us have probably asked at some point or another, which is, why did they do that? Why? And our tendency is to think about other people in our lives, people that we're leading, that we operate in close proximity with, and we feel confused about it. Why did they behave that way? Ask what they asked, do what they did. Every leader's asked that question, and things that other people do that just don't make sense to me. And you could probably, and it's okay, I'll go ahead and allow it to think about one person in your life where There's just some behavior that in the work setting specifically, modes of relating or ways of leading or acting that just don't make sense to you. Um, I'll give you a second to call that person to mind. It probably didn't take very long. Um, so how you think about that, and I would say confusion about people and their behavior is probably one of the most costly things on our calendars. It's one of the things we waste time reacting to, and a lack of understanding drives a lot of the ways that we relate and how we lead. So how we answer that question is really important. And one of our foundational premise of how do you know when you're leading versus managing people is rooted in really one question, and that is, or one statement, which is, what do I want for them, not merely from them? And so there's a mindset shift when it comes to being curious about people, thinking about people, leading people, developing people. Because my aim and your aim, if you're responsible for leading someone, then it is your primary responsibility. One of the hallmarks of effective leadership is whether or not their capacity and their maturity are improving or strengthening. And so if you are more focused on, and it's not that you don't need anything from them, but if you're more focused on what they're going to do for you and what you're needing from them than you are what you want for them, you've got to keep those two realities in close proximity and close relationship. And that will drive and inform a lot of the standard of how you relate to them, how you function with them. So a lot of times the problems that we create for ourselves is we've already predetermined or made a decision about who somebody is and how they are and how they're always going to be, versus remaining more curious, open-hearted, open-minded about what's actually going on. And part of what I want to introduce to you, when we say predictive human behavior, we're going to introduce and talk about the science of traits a little bit. What are traits and behavioral traits, and some of the things we need to unlearn, and some of the things we need to learn or continue to develop in order to grow into more effective leaders of people. We have a fun quote. Henry Ford was quoted as saying that he wanted the hands and he got the whole human. He just wanted the production of the humans. It's what he wanted from them. He didn't want to have to deal with the holistic nature of the human themselves. And that's the reality is, we are in the business of relating to people and leading them relationally, which means we get the whole human attached. Another really vital statistic that I think is imperative, and it's part of why we do the leadership development work we do. Statistically, it's been researched that the second most influential relationship in a human being's life about how they feel about themselves at any point is due to their relationship with their manager, with you. And the first is their spouse or partner. How they feel about themselves at any given point is most influenced outside of their home. It's most influenced by their relationship with you, and how you go about relating to them and what you want for them and how you communicate that and express that is a significant driving force. And to take that a little bit further, how they come home, how they talk about you, how they talk about work, how they relate to their families is directly related often to their relationship with you. I know that's been true for me in my journey. And so this topic is no small thing. And what I'll tell you too is this is not about getting more control over people. In fact, when you start to label someone is really when you stop leading them. How you label a person influences what you expect of them, influences what you notice or stop noticing. And so in some ways we're boxing people in, saying there are tons of examples from this. What opportunity, and if you can think back of times where you've been labeled, let's just say, and kind of put into a box or a way of being. This is how you'll always be. This is how you've always been. How that's limited you, how that's impacted your motivation. So, labels, you also start training other people of how to think about members of the team. Because this is another massive challenge for us as leaders as we start talking about people in terms of how you've labeled them, and we train other people to think about them through that lens. So it can be incredibly limiting and incredibly harmful to employees, to individuals, to ourselves, if we take I would say, the path of least resistance to try to label somebody. And I think a real critical question, and this is, again, I want you to be thinking about this for yourself. A real critical question is observing how quick you are, and this is true of me too, how quick we are to label people, to label their behavior. We're talking about on the job behaviors, things that we may observe from them, and certainly this has implications in all relationships. But specific to the workplace, when we assign a label to an individual and how quickly we form that opinion or attach that to them, and why would we do that? What is it that we're doing, and how might it be uh, helping us avoid conversations that we may need to have, or avoid ways of engaging with employees that would take more time. And that's a big undercurrent here as well, is do I make the time to properly understand, connect with, relate to, and appropriately and accurately describe some of the traits that drive an individual and their behavior. So, just to sequence this a little bit, when I observe a behavior, in this case, we said she asked a lot of questions. Then I create a narrative. She's uncertain about her own judgment. Somebody shouldn't be asking that many questions. They must lack confidence, as the label that I've attached to them. And then I may make a conclusion of, well, they're really not ready. Let's give it to somebody who is more confident. Now, this may be speaking more to how much I value decisiveness and confidence, maybe not as much accuracy and production. I may prefer speed over inquiry, and then judge inquiry as a lack of confidence. So I've got all of these biases and all of these narratives in my head that I've got to be careful of. And there's a term that we use, or that we didn't invent. I didn't invent. It's called a fundamental attribution error. And I don't want to use a bunch of jargon in this conversation, but a fundamental attribution error is when a quick example is, when I'm late, it's because I had a lot of really important, pressing, challenging things I had to tend to. When you're late, it's because you were not punctual and irresponsible and didn't care. That would be an example of me attributing characteristics to you based on your behavior that would be different or inconsistent of what I would apply to me. So this tendency for us to incorrectly attribute certain behaviors is something that we want to challenge in ourselves, something that we want to guard against, and ultimately become more curious, ultimately become more attentive to how we go about attributing character or character flaws to other people. So when I said earlier that this is not about getting control, I just want you to take a second, and at the end of the day, I think I could safely say most of us are really seeking control. And part of what frustrates me, part of what frustrates us, is that we really wish we had ultimate control, where we could make the market and make people and make vendors and make suppliers and make things function the way we wanted them to function. And so, and control is elusive, control is a pipe dream, control is out of our grasp. So we have to really ask ourselves, how much in control am I seeking compliance? Beginning with what I need. I apply pressure in order to get the behavior that I want. It could even become manipulative. I didn't list that, but ways that I may get passively or politely manipulative, attempting to force behavior, um, making them responsible, making somebody you're leading responsible for controlling another person. When you step into leadership, and you're functioning in a leadership way, in a stewardship way with that individual, you're cultivating their ownership of their own behavior, their own responsibility, their own actions, their own desired outcomes. You're more open to exploring what are they hoping to become? Who are they developing into? You help them develop the sense of internal responsibility. What are they wanting to commit to? What are they intrinsically motivated by? You're helping them build their capacity and help them become more capable of leading themselves, which is ultimately what we're after. Ultimately, we're after is other people that don't need me. And this is where, when I function with a high sense of control, I'm actually training people to become more dependent on me. I'm training people to rely more heavily on me, to look to me to interpret what they need to do. And so I say one thing. I say, I want you to own this. I want you to run with this. This is yours. You've got this. I believe in you. But my practice, or my what they experience with me, is different. It's more controlling than that. So I've got to make sure there's alignment. And part of the mindset or heart set shift that I'm wanting us to make in practice is that we're not seeking to control someone. They do have responsibilities, and we're not going to diminish that. And they do need to perform. We're not diminishing that. But I'm really seeking to understand their natural wiring first. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. But one of our aims, and I love this expression, and this is applicable to you too. Um, Part of our job as leaders is to help excavate someone's hope, that they would trust us with what it is they're hoping for. Our hope over the course of, every one of you carries a picture of how things ought to be. You can't see it, but you know it's possible, and that's what you're leading toward. That's what hope is. Hope by virtue is something that's probably not fully attainable, but you can't stop leading toward it. And so part of what, and every individual carries that picture with them, and you're trying to help individuals excavate that. What are they envisioning about their own future, and how can I help lead them toward that? And that's where their intrinsic motivators lie. Beneath things they've adapted to, which is what's exhausting for people when they overly adapted. So the excavation of hope takes time. It does take you taking the time to get to know the person that you're leading, so that you can lead them and not use them. You can lead them and not exploit them. You can lead them and not just demand that they become or behave a particular way, which is also the goal. That's what retention is. When people talk about, we got to work on our retention. We tend to start in the wrong places. Not We start with pay, which matters. We start with workload, which matters. But the reality is, we need to start with understanding, who are they hoping to become? What are they hoping to be? What are they hoping to accomplish? And do I know who they are and how they're wired to get there? So when you label somebody, you stop really leading them, is the point I'm trying to make. If they're difficult, lazy, dramatic, territorial, and interestingly, the work behind understanding the science behind traits was looking at the etymology, looking at the words we use to describe how people are and how they behave. and eliminating the ones that have value judgments to them or that are character references. And so we'll talk about it. So I want to move. So then the first movement here in this conversation is moving from labeling people. So that the person that you thought of earlier in the call, what are the labels that you've assigned to them? Would they agree with those labels? Or are those labels even helpful? Are those labels permanent? Labeling explains the person once, focuses on character, actually can diminish their character, produces frustration, typically is a conversation ender, and makes a behavior feel more like a defect. I'm a big picture person. I'm not a detailed person. Details cost me a lot of energy. That's not a defect. It's part of how I'm wired. Many of you could relate to that, or some of you are high detailed and big picture strategic conversations are frustrating. When you stop labeling and start reading, um, you're describing a pattern that can shift with context. And that's the other thing. I mean, just we have to understand about, and this is true because you feel it and see it in yourself. Um, your personality and your behavior is super contextual. When I start talking to people about their traits and their behaviors, they'll say, well, it depends on who I'm with. Are you talking about me at work? Are you talking about me at home? Are you talking about me with my employer? Or are you talking about me with my family? It's like your personality is highly contextual, um, definitely geared toward what else is going on in your life. What other pressures might you be carrying? But when you're reading somebody, you can hold several possibilities at once without having to definitively label it. The labeling feels very efficient because it makes you feel like you have more control, whereas having a hypothesis or having a theory elicits a question. My theory, I have a few theories about what might be disrupting your ability to perform or execute this task consistently. Can we talk about that? As opposed to you're failing, and you're not this, you're not that, you're not this. So a hypothesis leaves things open, and it's an ongoing relationship. It's an ongoing conversation that you will have. Uh, you know, uh, when you label somebody, it's not an ongoing conversation. And you don't give people room to continue to grow and develop themselves. This ties into, and this is off script here, but this ties into why as leaders are we bad? And I'm doing what I said not to do. Why do we as leaders struggle to consistently execute? And some of you guys don't struggle with this, but a lot of our clients that I talk to do. We struggle to have consistent reviews quarterly, monthly, annually. It feels like a really heavy burden. One of my hypotheses is that it's because we've labeled people and we think, well, they're not going to change, they're not going to adjust, they're not going to adapt. It's because we've pigeonholed people and we're not thinking about their development properly. So that's part of what I hope we can unlock, is that when every one of those reviews is about how are they aligned with the role and how is that alignment affecting the performance or the output, that's a different conversation than trying to seek control or leverage my authority to get them to do what I want them to do, or manipulate them in some way. So shifting from labeling to reading. Well, just to give some examples here, and we're not going to be able to exhaust all this, but hopefully this stimulates some thought. These are, if we call somebody, they're just difficult or they're obstructive. Maybe they prefer candor. Maybe they're less agreeable. Maybe there's some unresolved conflict that is historical, things that we haven't gone back and addressed that they're still carrying. Maybe they're unclear about what they actually have the authority to do. Do we call somebody lazy or attribute a lack of motivation, or they just don't have the want it? They don't have they're not a dog, they're not hungry, they don't want it bad enough. Well, maybe we haven't aligned what they're motivated by, and we'll talk about motivators here on this call too. And for those of you joining a little later, you're going to get all of this, the recording and the slide deck. So we're, you know, moving from labels into a more thoughtful, and at the end of the day, it's just more loving. You will feel way more loved or cared about by somebody if they're exploring what's true for you than assigning it to you. I don't feel very cared for when somebody tells me, "Well, this is just how you are and this is what you care about." I've known you for years and that's just what I've always seen. Is like, "Oh, thanks." So, are you lazy, or we haven't aligned what they care about with the role? Or is it just competency, something they haven't gotten depleted, that they haven't gotten proficient in, or they're just depleted because they're over functioning or they're adapting? Dramatic, a lot of our female clients, will get accused of being dramatic if they're expressive. We just label, or even sensitive. If you experience an emotion, that somehow you're sensitive, as opposed to maybe there's some things that you're threatened or feel threatened by that haven't been discussed or broached, or you haven't felt comfortable bringing to me. Maybe there's a bunch of unanswered questions. um, so you guys can read some of those. Too intense, I'll jump down to somebody that may be too intense, but maybe they've got a really high standard that hasn't been clarified, or they're feeling unclear about, how do we know if we're winning? How do I know if I'm succeeding? So moving from labels to hypothesis is one really big step, and I'll give you these kind of sequentially. Six steps basically for you when you're leading somebody. Describe the behavior you're observing without assigning a value to it. Don't try to judge it. So removing the verdict. Anything that you would attribute as a character defect, like remove that in your first initial observation, and consider three plausible reasons that somebody might be behaving the way that they are, and then get more curious, as opposed to judgmental. Investigate the pattern. Have you seen that behavior over time? And what is the impact it's having relationally? What's the impact it's having on their jobs? And then decide, how do you confront that? A lot of the things that we tolerate, and when we start to judge and then we give up on people, is because we have not actively, productively, effectively, with care, actually addressed behavior in this manner. And you would be amazed at the breakthrough you could facilitate if you were to take the time to give the make the observations, give the feedback, as opposed to dictate what you're seeing and how you're wanting somebody to behave, which feels more efficient, but it actually long term becomes more harmful. Some of the things that we tolerate, that we just dismiss, and we let those kind of rivers grow crooked behaviorally, is because we lacked the courage to sit across and it is scary, and y'all have done it. Sometimes you've done it well and sometimes you've done it poorly, but we lack the courage to sit across the table from somebody and say, can I give you some feedback about some things I'm observing that are impacting your role in other people, that I want to talk about with you? Like, can we do that consistently and effectively and build the type of trust? So, um, even if you just started instituting those six steps, and these patterns is where we start to get into this idea of predictability and traits. When you observe repeated behaviors, and when you can give examples or illustrations of where you're seeing that, then you have a much more a larger picture of what actually is going on. Even if you don't fully understand it, like you don't have to figure it out yourself. It can be done in relationship. um, and so one of the things that I try to avoid, and I know all of us can be, I love assessments, all of them. there's really not an assessment that I have taken or done or used that I haven't appreciated or gotten some value out of. The assessments that I struggle the most with, though, and when we deploy them, are the ones that put people into particular boxes. They turn them into an animal or a color or a singular label. And I know why we do that, because it takes some of the complexities out of it. We think it overly simplifies the conversation, so we can say, oh, you're simply this or you're simply that. And I'm not against that at all. Oftentimes, if you can just put somebody in a box of introverted or extroverted and say that's their label, but extroversion on a trait continuum is highly nuanced, and we'll talk about that. Some people feel extremely extroverted at work when in real in interpersonal relationships they're far more introverted at home or in other settings, or they may be highly friendly but very low sociability. So what you want to avoid is, again, kind of putting people in that box or putting in that label. And so when you think about somebody's trait, and I'm going to give you 5 dimensions here that many of y'all have probably heard this or seen this, but when you think about somebody's behavior, you just have to understand that it's on a continuum, and then how it is compared to the benchmark or the norm. So if somebody's really extroverted, who are you comparing them to? Are you comparing them to your family and that's the norm group? Or are you comparing them to Western civilization or to the rest of the world? Those benchmarks really matter. Or are you just comparing them to you? And so recognizing that people are on these continuums becomes really important. And one of the most powerful and complex ways of thinking about these 5 dimensions is called the Big Five. And it is one of the most well researched and scientifically validated and predictive ways of understanding human behavior. And so this is the source code of a lot of the assessments that are out there and tools, but it is such a powerful framework. And to me, in my, I certainly haven't studied all of these, but it is the most holistic and comprehensive. It spells the acronym OCEAN, openness to new experiences. How open is somebody, how original and creative are they versus and strategic versus tactical and execution oriented? Do they get a lot of energy from new and novel things versus execution? Conscientiousness, this is their internal drive, goal orientation, structure. How do they view the future, pursue the future, organize themselves around it? One of the most predictive traits in the workforce. Extroversion, which is the one we probably are most familiar with, but understand less or to a lesser degree. How much energy do they have for people versus things? Which is introverts would gravitate more toward things and tasks, and extroverts energized have a lot of energy or a big battery for people. Agreeableness versus candor. How much do I value harmony over candor? And then the N stands for neuroticism, which is the technical term, but really negative emotion or emotional stability. What's my baseline for anxiety? What's my baseline for reactivity under crisis or under pressure? So the purpose of this is just to have some shared vocabulary. When I'm attributing traits to a person, these are non-judgmental terms or frames that you can start to incorporate to how much energy they have for openness, high openness or lower openness to new novel ideas and change, as an example. So we start to frame it up through the lens of the Big Five, and there's a lot of resources out there. One of my favorite, Jordan Peterson has a course you can find online where he teaches through kind of the psychology behind these 5 categories, which is also really helpful and insightful. But you can find a lot of research to start learning more about these categories or these dimensions. And just to personalize this a little bit, I'm going to ask you to think about your own makeup, your own wiring. Where are you on the continuum of openness, as an example? So the far left of this continuum would be I prefer what's proven and familiar versus gravitating toward novel and exploratory. Conscientiousness, am I flexible if I go with my gut, super intuitive, low deliberation, kind of fast twitch, quick start? Or am I very structured and high follow through? I'm very intentional about what I take on and how much is already on my plate. And, where am I somewhere on that continuum? Um, Extroversion is more introspective on the far left and internal. I'm going to process, much more internally related versus extroverted, more expressive and more external. Agreeableness, I want to be direct, lower on the tact, continuum, less tactful, can be more insensitive, but certainly value directness and clarity versus fluff. Whereas on the far right side of that being, I value harmony above all else. I want to, tension in the room really makes me uncomfortable or unsettled. And then the neuroticism or emotional stability, hyper vigilant, somebody who's hyper vigilant, and am I always aware of potential threats or threat sensitivity of what could go wrong? Or, you know, California chill. If the smoke alarm goes off or the fire alarm goes off in our building, you'll wait it out and see if it's a test before you vacate the premise. So you can kind of visualize yourself of where you're on that continuum and notice that none of those are value judgments about somebody's character. It's really indicating how much energy do I have in a particular continuum. And there's no, the question isn't whether or not it's good or bad. And we'll talk about these traits not in terms of strengths or weaknesses, but high energy areas. What is the gravitational pull of my behavior? What is the gravitational pull of my personality? And what am I going to naturally gravitate toward? Now, we'll touch on this. Competency and behavior are not, and traits are not the same thing. So I can have a lot of energy for a particular behavior, but that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily great at it. That doesn't mean that I'm necessarily proficient or competent. Now, people do tend to get more proficient at things that they have high energy for. So people do tend to I may get better at something because I'm naturally energized by that type of work, even though I may not become the best at it, but I just keep moving toward it and I enjoy it and it doesn't cost me a lot. Um, but when pressure enters the equation, which I think all of us would say that in most of our work settings, there is a dimension of pressure. There's a sense of urgency. There are deadlines, bottom lines, top lines, objective performance that have to be met, which is appropriate. Pressure is a wonderful thing. Every human being is built to carry an appropriate amount of pressure. The architecture of our personalities allows us to carry a particular amount of pressure. Excessive pressure can create stress fractures and where people can kind of break. So under stress, if I've got chronic stress and chronic anxiety, which can probably accurately describe the environmental kind of emotional ecosystem that we're all living in. It's out of our control, but there is a sense of chronic anxiety. Intensity as a strength, which can often be sense of urgency, can suck the life out of a room. It can be overpowering. It can be intimidating. Intensity in and of itself can be a wonderful thing because it's going to invite people to pioneer new opportunities, and can sustain challenging effort over time or to help push people through difficult situations, but that can become overpowering. Precision or wanting excellence can become perfectionism. Nothing's right, nothing ships, it's never good enough, and nobody sleeps. We're all going to work 24/7 until this gets right. Agreeableness can become avoidance. It can become isolation. I can become overly accommodating. I just want to make people happy. Independence can become isolation. It's good to be able to operate independently and collaboratively. But if I am under stress, I might withdraw from the team. I might back away from the team, hide from the team. So every one of these traits that in and of themselves are powerful, and that's the thing. A trait on any point in that continuum has a lot of power to perform particular ways and to function in a particular way. But if there's a lack of cohesion on the team, if there's a lack of relational connectivity, then you can almost always expect a human's behavior to degrade to the stress side of their particular trait. Um, and so, as a leader, properly diagnosing that, properly attuning to that, understanding where it's coming from, and broadening your vocabulary of understanding what might be going on, and helping the employee or the people you're developing see it, and name what the stress might be to help them define what's real. That becomes really powerful, even though it takes a lot of time. And I'll say this often, and that when it comes to people, you want to think in terms of effectiveness, not efficiency. When it comes to things and tasks and processes, let's be efficient as we can be. When it comes to people, our task is to be as effective as possible in relating to them. And relationships are just not efficient. Now they can become efficient the more connection there is, the more trust there is. They actually become very efficient, but they still take a lot of time and they still take a lot of energy. So when you put, so if you're leading a team of people, which most of you are, knowing who's a lot of y'all on this call, when you put all these different traits and these different energies into a room trying to move toward a shared goal and struggle towards something that we've all determined matters, there's going to be collision. And what we want to train our teams to be able to do is to contend well without competing. When I'm competing with members of my team, I'm actually competing for what? Because there's no trophy, there's no scorecard or scoreboard really. I'm really competing for control. And so when we're competing on a team, I'm trying to get control. But when I'm contending, where the word contend, many of y'all have heard me say this before, is to reach out together for the truth. We're all reaching out toward what's most true so then we can take the most meaningful action. And I need all the energy in the room to help see what's most true because I can't see it all for myself. They can't see it all for themselves. So where the collision often happens is with people relate around pace. So you got people who are moving fast, want to make quick decisions. You interpret deliberation as a lack of confidence, or deliberate thinkers think that speed is reckless. So we're applying judgment to that. With structure, if I'm somebody that likes to go with my gut and see what's most pressing for the moment, I can respond to that. And so if I'm too structured, then I'm focusing on the process, not training the skills and the abilities of the people that need to adapt or function within that role. Um, Candor. If I'm somebody who wants to be really direct, or somebody who seeks harmony, and I feel attacked by people who are really direct. And in both cases, whether you're direct or harmonious, you could be trying to bring protection to the team. People who are highly intense that um, you know, feel like it's if I'm really intense, I want certainty. I want to know. I don't like the ambiguity, and ambiguity feels like a risk. So you've got all of these things converging that you as a leader are trying to foster, facilitate, organize, and it's a massive challenge. It's almost impossible, and that's part of why we want you to have a deeper understanding of what's actually going on, so you can and we'll say if you mislabel something, as I said earlier, If you improperly label it, then you'll certainly not be able to lead it. And so you've got to be part-time psychologist and understanding some of these behaviors and some of these traits. So as I mentioned, a trait is not a competency. So I'll say these are 7 layers, that form human behavior or how a person is going to behave. A trait is going to be the thing that comes most naturally with the most amount of energy. So how a person behaves with the most amount of energy for the longest period of time is typically trait based. And a trait is probably best illustrated as a cell in a battery. So your battery has all these various cells in it, these traits in it of how decisive you are, how deliberate you are, your self regard, how harmonious or agreeable you are, or how candid you are or tactful you are. These are all energies that form behavior, but there's also another layer of motivation. And I'll talk about these 6 drivers that we look at in terms of, and motivation is really all about what work is most meaningful. And if you pay attention to the person you thought about at the beginning of this call, what you may assume is most meaningful to them may not be accurate at all. And you've got to excavate that. And we'll give you some more framework for that. A competency is what somebody's become efficient in, whether it's with spreadsheets or whether it's AI proficiency these days. It's what task have they learned and leverage their traits and motivators and become really proficient in a particular function. Most job descriptions are poorly written because they don't understand the traits that and the motivators that inform the competence. And so one of the ways when we're talking to our teams and revisiting the job description and the role fit, it's really important to make sure that as we get to know the person that we're adapting that role and those expectations accordingly, to make sure it's aligning with what's motivating to them and what's meaningful to them. It's part of our jobs as leaders. Energy is what allows them to sustain that effort over time. Emotional intelligence is the EQ. It's the way that I relate that effectively to other people. So, as an example, I can be a very intense person, and I can manage that relationally with poor emotional intelligence, which is when I'm the most destructive or I create the most disintegration on a team because I can be demanding, I can be demeaning, I can be sarcastic. I'm glad nobody can amen that because you can't talk. I'm glad you're muted. There are people on this call that could, but like I can be those things when I'm not operating out of a place of emotional intelligence. When I am operating with a developed emotional intelligence, then I can manage that in a more relatable way. And I can express the truth of what I'm afraid of, what I'm tempted to try to control, and what I'm actually needing from the team to help me see clearly and act accordingly. That all can be coached, but that takes a lifetime to learn how to live. Um, a lot of what you and I are trying to manage, okay, this is huge. A lot of what you and I are reacting to in other people and what we're attempting to control is their adapted self. How that individual has learned or felt necessary to adapt themselves in order to fit a role. And this is really important to pay attention to. When you, for yourself and also for others, observe someone being depleted, we may use the language burned out, exhausted. They're going to use some of these words, but when they're describing feeling depleted, what that typically means is not that there's too much work to do. It's that they have overextended themselves, overexerted themselves in low energy areas that have not been meaningful. Now, a loyal employee, a conscientious employee, somebody who is actually cares about the mission, they'll adapt for a long time because they want to contribute. They want to be a team player. It's not always something that they're doing wrong or that they're pretending to be something they're not. It's that they're trying to do what the team needs them to do. It's just that has a shelf life. And so part of your leadership is meeting them in that and saying, hey, I see what you've been doing, and I can tell that it's taking you longer to recover. Like, somebody that's, and so we would put this in the category of resiliency. When you adapt a lot and your recovery time gets longer and longer and longer, that's depleting your resilience or your ability to bounce back. So really important. Am I responding or leading their adapted self, or am I leading their prevalent self? And then the performance is actually the production of what actually is the outcome in their particular context of what work they're producing and how well that aligns with objectives and the mission. This is so much. There's a lot. Hopefully, it's helpful. So, I just want you to be able to pause before you react and label someone, that you have some mechanism to step back and recognize what might be going on in an individual, and then determine what steps you might take in order to develop them, realign them in their role. Because, and the part of this that becomes predictive is, if you recognize, and this is an example, there was a client who had an employee who was assigned by a temporary agency, and when that employee was with the temp agency, they functioned in a more independent role, in an independent way. Well, then the company loved their work, so they hired them. Well, they put that employee in the office around other people. The environment changed. Well, come to find out that that employee's productivity diminished dramatically. Their enjoyment for the work diminished dramatically. Well, they're extremely introverted and extremely low on the openness scale, and so that became a drain. It became an energy suck for them, and it impacted their performance. And so when that was and so instead of judging the behavior and saying they didn't care, they weren't working hard enough, it was like, man, that environment shift really was costly for you. Let's figure out a way to, I said, you'd be better off putting them in a broom closet and giving them a laptop, which they didn't. That'd be inhumane. But that's what we're looking for. That's the type of diagnostics that we want to be capable of. Um, when you're looking at somebody's natural or prevalent energy and their competency, their energy and their capability are not the same. So where someone has raw potential, they've got higher natural energy, maybe less experience or less reps in that particular competence, but they're energized, but they're not developed yet. So that's where I know, as a leader, I need to keep training them. I need to keep offering, I need to help them apprentice and learn how to do it proficiently, and they'll do that well. Um, Development or fit question is like, if they're lower energy, and you just, and I'm just referring to those five dimensions currently. If they're low energy and they're low extroversion, and their role requires a lot of people interaction, then that's something I'd want to evaluate. Is it a good fit for them? Is it a win for them and for the company? And the natural strength is obviously where those two things, the competency, the capability, and the natural energy and motivators align. Um, and then this is the one that we miss most often. And this is where, as leaders, it's a real gut check. What do you do when you have somebody who's extremely proficient and effective and productive in a role, but it's depleting to them? And that's where the challenge and the dilemma of releasing them from that in some form or fashion, or moving them into a different role within the company, or even, in some cases, transitioning them out so that they can keep growing and developing. Back to our opening remark of wanting more for someone than from someone. This box down here becomes a real test of our leadership intent. Um, so, one question you could ask right now is, where do you see that bottom right quadrant? Somebody on your team that's extremely capable, but it costs a lot. And I love that expression. When I think, going back to my detail example for myself, I can do details, but it costs me a lot. Now there are, and we'll move fast. We're coming up on time here. there are six, what we use in our framework is these six drivers, and it just fits. There's lots of ways for you to think about this, but six intrinsic motivators that determine what work is most meaningful for an employee or for an individual. A theoretical driver is driven by knowledge. We call them our professors. They want to understand, they want to learn, they want to analyze. Lots of power there. Utilitarians are, I'm high utilitarian. That's why there's more information than there should be in this one particular presentation, because I wanted to make it worth your time. And to me, that meant giving you as much information as possible, even though it's free. So usefulness, practicality, a tangible return, very much aware of time and what's the fastest way, what's the fastest route, what's the most efficient. Aesthetic drivers want form and harmony. Aesthetics work to live. Utilitarians live to work. And so if you can see the conflict that could emerge even in those three. Utilitarians and theoreticals may clash because it's not efficient to continue researching when I already have enough information to make a decision. Altruistic or social, one to be helpful. What's the most helpful? It may not be economically viable. It may not be efficient. It may not even make analytical sense, but it feels the most helpful right now. And you're going to have a hierarchy of these. These you would rank in some order, and you could rank yourself in terms of where you see that hierarchy lining up for yourself. Individualistic, or what could be called political. I value autonomy. I value influence. I value climbing a ladder, or it's more meaningful for an individualistic person to be in a position of authority. Most people, this is why executive leadership teams can be challenging, because everybody that gravitates toward typically that gravitates toward an executive leadership team has high individualistic driver, but then they can also become competitive and political because they start jockeying for position, and it becomes the CEO and owner's job to regulate that. And then traditional or regulatory, this is finding a highly defined system for living. What are the principles and the structure and the disciplines that we're going to enact to protect ourselves from veering too far off course or too far off mission? We could do an entire hour on all of these, and we probably should. Let me know if you want to do that. We will, because these are just rich. These are rich ways to help you see people clearly, to see yourself clearly, and then to lead them clearly. So when we're talking about a person's emotional intelligence and really a personality, this is why I'm so kind of against typing a person, just giving them a singular title or color or letter to tell them who they are and how they are. Your traits are part of what comes naturally with energy. Your motivators determine what's most meaningful to you and most worth your time and sacrifice even. Your EQ is what helps you measure yourself and govern yourself relationally. And then these are five realms of the emotional intelligence: self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal relationships, decision making, stress management. So when you're leading somebody, the reason it's frustrating is because we are all very complex. And part of the way that you and I are going to build the most trust is by understanding what is driving somebody's behavior, what they find to be most meaningful, and what are the emotional skills they could develop in order to be more effective. When I'm coaching people on executive teams that feel like they're not getting heard, that their message isn't getting across, it's like, what is it about the way you're presenting yourself or representing your message that's keeping it from being received? What barriers might there be that's blocking it? So, I know we got to wrap up. I'd say a few things in closing here. Lead the person you have. You want to develop that person and build their capacity. Redesign the role if that's what's necessary. And I've seen a lot of y'all do that. I've seen that done really well, where the organization is living and breathing. And sometimes we're not big enough to do that internally. complement the person, how do we work as a team and complement the individuals where we can, or even be willing to help them transition within the company into a different role or department, or even outside of that, because their development is more important than my control of them. So, one step, and we call this the integrated leader report. And, an action step, if you haven't done this with us already, and this is not a, sales pitch, but we take those three and you can, for yourself or for somebody else, assess at a highly validated level your traits, your motivators, and your EQ. And we produce this integrated leader report that helps you understand those natural drivers and how you might be adapting. So, the closing question here is, when I'm leading somebody, am I trying to make this a person easier for me to manage, or am I trying to develop their capability? And part of you developing their capability is better attuning to their traits. And we introduced the big five of their openness to new experiences, their conscientiousness, how goal oriented are they, how much people energy do they have, how agreeable are they, and how emotionally stable or sensitive, threat sensitive are they, risk averse are they, and then how they're motivated, what they're motivated by, what they find, what work they find to be most meaningful, and how their emotional intelligence may impact the team that they're on. I will send all these slides to you, the recording to you. Would love to hear your questions, feedback, comment. We're reactivating what we call our EBG labs or leadership labs. And so there'll be more of these in the future. So thank you all so much for taking time to be with us. You can learn more on our website. Certainly reach out to me on my email, shad@edmondsonberry.com. But in the meantime, keep leading courageously. Stay curious. Your people need you now more than ever. Thank y'all. Have a great rest of your day. And yeah, email me if you have questions that we didn't get to field today.